Hello, Robs. We're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me, Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide by Dorothy Bloch. Continue with Chapter 3, the story of Danny. They insisted they belonged to the opposite sex. Danny's father was undoubtedly the most dependable parent at that time and continued to remain so. He woke Danny up every morning and got him his breakfast in a fairly reliable ritual. He was also the one to take him to the store to buy him whatever he needed. His father's way of relating to him, unfortunately, took the form of kidding around. However, he apparently delighted in feeding Danny misinformation and then roared at the results. Danny consequently concluded that he must be a comedian. By 5.5, he had come to recognize that he never knew when he was being taken and made it a rule always to be a little suspicious. There were always new traps, however. My father is going to build a house this summer, he volunteered one day, and he says, I can help. I can hammer the nails. Danny's father was a building contractor, a tall, muscular man whose measured speech and mocking laughter suggested a controlled violence that never ceased to be a major preoccupation. It was Danny's mother, however, who kept the ground shifting beneath his feet. She was a small, attractive woman whose tenuous hold on reality extended to her perception of her children. Danny was never sure how real his existence was where she was concerned. When he returned from school, it was a toss-up whether he would find her or the housekeeper or just a message that she would be home in 10 minutes. A possible prelude to what seemed like endless waiting. He always ate alone with his brother and sometimes didn't see her for the entire evening. His anxiety about whether she would forget him altogether was a constant factor in his treatment until he was old enough to take care of himself. The school bus dropped him at my door, but his mother picked him up at the end of the session. She was usually late, but it wasn't until Danny actually saw her that he could be sure she would come at all. His fears were only too well grounded, and I discovered one afternoon when she phoned sometime after the session to tell me that he had completely slipped her mind, and would I put him in a cab. Bungle fucker. Not until several years later did I learn of one particular fantasy with which Danny defended himself at that time. He stated, everybody was putting on a show for me. You weren't Dorothy Bloch. People were posing as my parents. They used to be there, but someone took them away. I still think so sometimes. They made themselves look like my parents, but they tied my real parents up. I guess my real parents would be nicer to me. They'd love me more. These other people, I guess, wouldn't really. The thing I wonder is if you're interviewing just random children who are actually healthy, happy, and so-called normal, which I'm not sure any child is, if they would talk in these same manners. The more real aspect of Danny's world actually was a show. Any exploration of the decisive elements in his life would be incomplete without taking into account the influence of television. He was set adrift in it without chart or compass and permitted to expose himself to its deadly rays for 4 or 5 hours a day. During the week and apparently endless hours on weekends, the world of violence it projected became his continuing frame of reference. When he wasn't watching it, he was thinking about it. Where other children related their encounters in the real world, Danny spoke of the latest exploits of his favorite television characters. It was a mark of progress when he turned from his preoccupation with war to the Jetsons, who lived in a house of the future, and became his model for family life. For him, the new frontiers of science featured, among other things, hypodermic syringes that made it possible to melt down brains, invade minds, transform not only personalities but flesh and bone, and cause people to disappear. Atomic warfare became television real, and invasion from outer space imminently threatening. Do midgets have to go to war? He inquired apprehensively, obviously referring to himself. The world was peopled with monsters, and the powers of evil flourished. Apparently, for Danny, all of this was simply a corroboration and perhaps an elaboration in another dimension and on a vaster plane of his perceptions of the world of reality. The television screen also provided him with one helpful fantasy. However, he was Superman. Only occasionally did I get intimations of the dimensions of this secret involvement. He could repeat the opening lines of the program verbatim, and from time to time for several years was preoccupied with the design and creation of an appropriate costume. In my effort to understand the quality of the impact of this world of horror and monstrosity on Danny, I had the impression that it came in on him unfiltered. There appeared first of all to be no frame of reference that allowed him to sift and strain this material and to emerge with some sense of balance between the real and the unreal. Not only did he not enjoy the protection of a limited exposure, but he had little acquaintance with this kind of health that could have provided the necessary foil to the sick imaginings of the television screen. Quite on his own and without the intervention of outside forces, he could conjure out of the darkness of the night images of sufficiently blood-curdling terror. With the aid of modern technology, however, his own powers were expanded into infinity. As he related to me, since I saw the Phantom of the Opera, I never take my eyes off my room. In addition, I had the impression of a decided failure in his filtering system. The first outward sign that something was wrong with it was the fixed smile with which he attempted to barricade himself for lack of something better. His parents had concluded from it that he was a happy, carefree child. When it began to dissolve in the course of therapy, exposing his sadness, they attacked the treatment. The smile, however, was only one facet of Danny's armature. His inner world of thought and feeling was also vaulted and double-locked. Danny actually gave the impression that he thought the key was in everyone else's pocket. His rejection of all responsibility for what went on inside him gave rise to some strange phenomena. At one point, about 2 years after he started treatment, Danny began to complain that his eyes watered. His parents responded after a while by taking him to an eye doctor who could find nothing wrong with the ducts. Nevertheless, the watering persisted. Danny related to me that it could happen anywhere, sometimes without any warning in the middle of his lessons at school or on his way to my office or while he was just sitting doing nothing at home. The problem was clarified during one particular session when he described in some detail a televised ball game in which he had seen a baby in the audience. He didn't know what was going on, said Danny. I looked at him for a moment and then commented, I don't know if you remember when you were a baby. He paused and volunteered, I sucked my mother's bosoms when I was a baby. I'm sorry I did it, he added. I don't like warm milk. I don't either. I guess there are some things you don't like about her, I ventured. That's true, he agreed for the first time. That could be said of anybody. Especially when she leaves you alone. My eyes still water, he stated, as though we both understood the meaning of that term and its relation to what we were talking about. Do you think your eyes water when you feel sad, I asked. I think so, Danny agreed. People frequently feel like crying when they're unhappy, I said, and with that, Danny granted himself the right to sadness and tears. Danny maintained a similar relationship to his thought processes. They didn't belong to him. Some years later, when he was able to lay claim to himself, he marveled, I can't get over it, that it's in my mind, and it does all these things, that it's mine. There have been intimations that he had not thought it was his from the very beginning. During an early session, when he had been shooting darts against the wall, I observed, you seem pretty angry to me. How do you know, he asked. Do I look it? No, I said, you generally smile, but underneath I think you're angry. What am I angry at, he demanded. Danny's conviction that his thoughts could be read had already been established. As he explained sometime later, he kept himself from thinking in order to avoid exposure. The revelation of the power he imputed to others always startled me, however. I think you're mad at me, I again commented one day. He looked at me in evident surprise. You mean you think when I'm walking down the hall behind you that I want to stick a knife in your back? Similarly, on another occasion, I observed, I noticed that you don't like to tell me what happens in school. You mean about Ronnie, he retorted, that he wants to kill me? Well, I told him he'd be electrocuted. When Danny began to take notice of his own inner workings, he at first approached them cautiously. After finishing an airplane model, he stated, a thought went through my mind to break off all the propellers, but I think I won't. When he began to grasp the true dimensions of the swelling rage inside him, he felt impelled to define it in verbal terms. An angry man could knock through a wall, he declared one day. He could smash your desk. Even more, an angry boy could tear a mouth apart, he asserted, pulling his own mouth out of shape. He could if he was angry. He could knock down a wall. When his anger finally erupted, Danny found it overwhelming. I commented one day, I think you're very worried. Maybe if you tell me about it, I can help you. You mean so that I won't be mad and scream all the time? Danny's fear of being murdered as well as his suicidal wishes were apparent in the fantasies that he revealed from the beginning of treatment. Initially, he created the fantasy in which I was locked up at one end of the terrace while he reclined in a lounger at some distance. Before this one. When I commented after some minutes that he must be tired, he stated, my enemies are far away and I'm resting. For weeks after that, he occupied us with the murder and disposal of multitudes or hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. His scathing comments about my poor performance and the ineffectual quality of my assistance left no doubt about both the formidable character of his enemies and the unreliability of help. When he turned to play with soldiers, the soldier who represented himself was inevitably destroyed. At a later point, about 2 years after the beginning of his treatment, when he drew a new style airplane and announced that it exploded, I asked, what happened to the pilot? He parachuted, Danny replied. Then, as an afterthought, only he forgets to pull the cord until he lands, then he pulls it. He gets killed, I added to Danny's ascent. During the same period, he frequently confronted me with various types of suicidal riddles. What would happen, he asked, if a boy was put in a sack and thrown off the roof? What if he was tied up in a rug? What if it was made of iron or lead? What would happen if a boy was on a roof and he sniffed glue until he went crazy and he didn't know what he was doing and he jumped off? Nevertheless, alternating with his suicidal fantasies, there gradually began to emerge fantasies in which all his soldiers were demolished, but he alone made his getaway in a plane. It was following that time that the first intimations of a homosexual fantasy were revealed. His interest in the Jetsons had already displaced his preoccupation with war, and their house became the subject of his drawings. During one session, he announced that he would draw anything I liked, and when I suggested a boy like Richard, he quickly asserted, I can't draw boys. He started a figure that looked like a capital M, apparently 2 legs and a penis, but he quickly turned the paper over in obvious dissatisfaction and drew a figure that consisted of 2 sticks with a double cross piece on the top, capped with a head and long hair, and referred to it as her. He next drew father and mother, the father simply being a larger version of her, without the hair, and the mother having enormous arms swinging upward. As an afterthought, he added huge hands on lion arms on the father and outsized hands on her. Shortly afterward, Danny had an experience that apparently precipitated the transformation of his homosexual fantasy into a homosexual identity. Although he was still quite small for his age, at 8.5, he was a very handsome boy with a very pleasant, agreeable manner that you called fake earlier. For the first time, his mother selected him as her sole companion on a week's vacation in California. He returned tense and anxious, however, with a new and embarrassing problem. He had a constant urge to urinate. His need to leave the room very frequently at school mortified him. But the real nightmare was the prospect of camp with such a condition. From time to time, I had proposed to Danny with little success that he use the couch, and now when he presented his predicament to me, I took the opportunity to suggest again that if he used the couch and simply talked, we might both begin to understand it. You mean before camp? He demanded eagerly. On the couch, he initially spoke of his continuing difficulty in making friends and his brother's wish for him to die. By the 3rd session, however, he reported a dream about a naked lady who was taking a bath in a sink in his room with her legs hanging over. After describing the dream, he stated that he saw a jet plane, a black one with a long point, hovering in the room. He confessed that he liked to think of naked women, and although he had seen his mother naked only once, when he was 4, he frequently saw her in just her bra and pantyhose, only he couldn't see through them. It appears that he saw her a lot that way in California, although she always went into the bathroom to put her nightgown on, and they slept in separate beds. He was continually preoccupied by sexual thoughts and stated several times that he couldn't wait to grow up to do it. He also wanted to know about fucking and presented the concept that when a man fucks, he makes in a woman's vagina. As I corrected this concept, it became clear that his urge to urinate resulted from his overstimulation and his impression that the sex act involved urination. Hey, he knew squirters. He was ahead of his time. He happily devoted the next few sessions to his sexual fantasies about his mother. What the fuck, lady? His urination problem disappeared and he went off to camp without this particular anxiety. After the summer and for the next year and a half, however, Danny was obviously acting out a homosexual identity. Although he initially resumed playing as his anxiety mounted, he decided to return to the couch. His first communication then related to his sex play with two boys in his class, one of whom ignored him after the experience. During the following months, he also adopted unmistakable feminine mannerisms. The Beatles were the vogue at that time, and long hair for males was just coming into fashion, and Danny let his hair grow. He also selected clothing with an unusual interest for his age in color, texture, and line. As he lay on the couch, he appeared constantly to be absorbed in admiring his legs. He also began to adopt what might be called a feminine walk. Although his exhibitionism provoked the children at school, Danny apparently preferred their attacks to what he had previously experienced as a rejection or indifference. He also appeared to derive satisfaction from their taunting him with being a girl. His father also reported during one session that at 3 different times during a week's trip, adults had pretended to mistake him for a girl, to Danny's delight. Danny's sessions during this period were also marked by frequent references to this confusion and his apparent enjoyment of it. A development then occurred that might have led to the resolution of his problems. About a year before, Danny had persuaded his father to buy him a trumpet, and as a trumpeter he began to win the admiration of his classmates. He soon joined a combo that was deemed good enough to be hired for parties. His brother had also been in treatment for the past year, and both his life and his way of relating to Danny had improved. He took pride in Danny's accomplishments, and his friends now urged Danny to play with them. He accepted several invitations to perform at high school parties and was very successful. He had also begun to distinguish himself at school as an actor. It was the high point of his life. Contempt and ridicule became a thing of the past. For the first time, not only was he free of suicidal thoughts, but his acceptance by others, particularly by his brother, and his unprecedented feelings of worth led to a self-acceptance that appeared to make any reversal of identity unnecessary. He carried himself with a new dignity and seemed confident about making friends and organizing his life. At that point, his mother suddenly decided to leave the family and move to the West Coast. Danny's immediate response was to plunge into a relationship with a girl in his class that was much more intense than is usual in an 11-year-old. It lasted for almost a year and ended in a shower of recriminations that he recognized were clearly related to his rage at his mother. His brother had also terminated treatment and reacted to his mother's abandonment with reawakened hostility toward Danny. Although Danny did not resume the outward symbols of his feminine identification, from time to time he betrayed the existence of his secret identity. Whenever I saw fit to make any generalization about boys, for instance, he invariably objected to the exclusiveness of my reference. Following the severance of his relationship with his girl, he returned to sex play with the same 2 boys and described the mutual masturbation that had taken place. In attempting to diminish any feelings of guilt that might have resulted, I commented, "Boys sometimes like to do that." He immediately protested with, "Why do you always say boys? Why don't you say boys and girls?" At another time he's right, why didn't she? At another time during the discussion of his fantasy that I always emerged for his session after making love in the other room. At another time during the discussion of his fantasy that I always emerged for his session after making love in the other room, I commented that maybe he had thought of making love to me. Oh my God, this fucking bitch should be thrown out of the profession. Adding, boys very often can think of making love to women. I again drew the protest. "You know, it's very funny. You always say boys. You never say girls." Yeah, he's right. You never say girls. This doesn't mean anything. During the period of his relationship with the girl, when he came to his session one day feeling very depressed, he reported that when he had called and asked her what she was doing, she had replied, "Shimmying on the door. It feels like fucking." At first, Danny was shocked and then depressed. Acting on a hunch, I stated that the conversation made him realize that he and his girl were different. He could never feel the same way about a door. At that, he remembered wanting to know what it was like to menstruate just once. I'm going to say right now, it probably should be outlawed that a therapist talk to a kid like this. Do you want to have sex with me? What the fuck is that? That can't be allowed in professional counseling anymore. Following his father's remarriage, Danny's life situation continued to deteriorate. Until the termination of his treatment, his major preoccupation became acceptance by boys to the seeming exclusion of any interest in girls. Whether that was a passing phase or whether he later acted out his fantasy of a homosexual identity, I have no way of knowing. When we compare Danny's fantasies with those of the children discussed earlier, we note a difference in their characters, and as we would expect in the life situation that produced them. Of the four, Danny was the most threatened and the least protected. Not only did he feel that all the members of his family wanted him killed, but I don't know who wanted him killed. His brother said he wanted to fucking kill him, but anybody who has brothers always was under the threat that they were going to kill them. But there was no one who offered him sufficient refuge for him to feel loved. His initial fantasies were therefore concerned with suicide and death. It is noteworthy that only when the treatment situation established enough security to allow him to turn from them to family life via television, the first intimations of a fantasy of a feminine self emerged. Danny's acting out did not commence until after his vacation with his mother, however, because her seductiveness and her preference for him over his father and brother increased the precariousness of his position by sharpening the already existing rivalry and by making him even more vulnerable to attack. To protect himself against his fear of murderous retaliation by demonstrating his innocence in relation to his mother, and to secure the love that he felt was his only bulwark against annihilation, he adopted an opposite sexual identity. Following his initial desperate response to his mother's abandonment and his involvement with the girl, his inexpressible yearning for his father's and brother's love with its promise of protection also reasserted itself. Among the children I have treated, those who acted out the fantasy of a different identity had all been exposed to an environment that offered little emotional security from persistent acted-out violence. Detachment was frequently the only refuge available. Although the child may have been nurturing a fantasy of a different identity for some time, its actual acting out in all instances was precipitated by a single event that intensified already existing terror and convinced him that his life was in imminent danger. At that point, he decided that the only way to save himself was to be someone else, generally someone who was invulnerable to attack. In the case of the four children who acted out the fantasy of a homosexual identity, each felt his life was threatened by the parent of the same sex. I don't see, I guess, with all four, the feelings and the behavior of the parents toward each other and toward him convinced him that not only did they not love each other, but that the parent of the opposite sex preferred him to the other parent. His expectation of the latter's retaliation in an atmosphere that was marked by violent acting out and a paucity of genuine loving feelings led him to conclude that only a change of sex could secure the fucking bungling motherfucker. Hey, Danny, you want to have sex with me, buddy? What is she talking about? I can't get over that she said that to him. I commented that maybe he had thoughts of making love to me. I can't believe this woman wasn't disbarred after the disclosure of this book. Of sex could secure the threatening parent's love and thus save his life. In 3 instances, the children sought the drastic solution when an already charged situation was further exacerbated by the birth of a sibling of the opposite sex of one who resembled the parent of the opposite sex. In the 4th, intimations of a reversal of sexual identity emerged with the diminution diminution of suicidal and death fantasies. When the mother chose the child as her sole companion and exposed him to the intimacy of a pure bedroom, his fear of retaliation from his father and his father's violent surrogate, his brother. That's his fucking surrogate. This lady's fucking outrageous. Now, the fucking brother who's acting like a boy and threatening to kill him like all brothers threaten to kill each other is now his surrogate. Increased his already considerable terror of being killed by them and precipitated the acting out of the fantasy of an opposite sexual identity. In all instances, the child's magical thinking, which generally leads him to equate thoughts, wishes, and feelings with deeds, further undermined his sense of safety when he was confronted with actual violence and an inadequate supply of love. He expected to be killed. In a desperate attempt to save his life at a specific moment of what he experienced as acute danger, he therefore transformed himself. In so doing, he hoped both to neutralize the violence of the threatening parent by eliminating what he perceived as its cause and to secure the love that would protect him against it. Although not all instances of the persistent acting out of the fantasy of a homosexual identity can be explained by the dynamics that prevailed in the cases of these four children, the similarity of all four is very striking and suggests that those dynamics may be present in a large number of cases. A great deal can also be learned from them about the symptomatology of adult homosexuality. The homosexual's frequent insistence that his fantasy is real, that he actually does belong to the opposite sex or a third sex, or that he was born that way, cannot help reminding us of the unwavering intensity of the children's assertions. When we also recall that with all four children, the stake was life or death, we may be in a better position to assess the meaning of the self-deception and denial that are so essential in maintaining the adult fantasy. That's curious that the "born that way" slogan was around back when this book was written in 1983? 78, sorry. I mean, that's... So what's that, 22? Almost 50 years ago. Yeah. Curious. These theories take time to grab hold, and then they just keep pounding it in until it becomes a reality, which is why I can see why people move to the wilderness and never come back out. But I need books and pumpkin beer, so I'm not going. And I guess I could get old pitchforks in the wilderness. Probably not many, though. Estate sale in the middle of the hinterlands. Anyways, goodbye, Robs. Good boy.